Hey everybody, today I was just going to do another Inquisitorial thoughts discussion. This would be the second episode, and today I just wanted to talk a little bit about metal versus plastic versus or resin miniatures. This is a discussion that actually has come up quite often in forums. It comes up repeatedly in the your local gaming shops, and as far as everybody has their own preference, usually everybody has a preference to some degree. I wanted to talk a little bit about it today, and I guess the reason is I'm working, as many of you that have watched the channel know, I'm doing my French and Indian War, and I'm working on my British regular infantry, and these are models by Conquest, but distributed / owned. I'm not sure what rights Warlord has to them. I'm assuming that they own them now. Not sure, but basically they're Warlord models originally produced by Conquest. These ones, I've seen videos where people have talked about them, unboxed them, and essentially I've cleaned them up, but people have mentioned just how they require a fair bit of flash removal. There was a little bit, but to be honest, I have seen a lot worse, and I had really no problem. As a matter of fact, maybe it was just because of the mood that I was in this morning, but I just really put on some music and had some caffeine and was just working away on these metal models, just cleaning them up, and I actually quite enjoyed it, and got me thinking about doing an Inquisitorial Thoughts video on this subject of materials in our miniatures. Now, I do find when it comes to the quality of the various different types of material that they make these miniatures out of, the end result quality, I think oftentimes that's really going to lie with the casting house or company, because a lot of times I've heard people make comments, and I want to have some discussion on it today or in the comments section about which ones hold better quality or where you can get the better quality as far as appearance and design. I think really the company, in my experience, is really going to reflect a lot on that. I mean, if you look at a company like GW, which really produces excellent miniatures, whether it be Forge World or GW, but they have like superb sculptors. And so, of course, you're always going to be limited by the technology you use or empowered by it, but you're also, at the end of the day, have to have really good artists in order to produce good miniatures. And that may just seem like common sense, but I think there's a bit of a blur when you start looking at, you're choosing your miniatures and you're choosing the company and the kind of miniatures they are, and you can kind of wonder whether it's because of the material or because of the sculptor, etc., etc. I initially, when I first started in the hobby, I wasn't even really painting that much, but it was many, many years ago, and the only thing that was really available that I was aware of were metal miniatures. And so there's definitely a history, and I believe that lead miniatures are sort of where this hobby really has its foundations in, and so there's a history there, and that's where the hobby kind of comes from, in as far as I understand it, in most cases. When I initially got back into the hobby, maybe roughly 3 years ago, metal miniatures is where I sort of started painting, and for me it was simply, I kind of like the idea of the heft of the miniature. There was just this aspect of it being worth more, as a metal product, and the heft and the feel on the table, and that's kind of why I initially was drawn to just starting to paint with metal miniatures. But then quickly, when reading other people's opinions and seeing what other people had to say, and then getting some plastic models or resin models, I quickly moved towards being interested in resin models and plastic models. And I think there were a number of reasons for that. But recently, after getting more into historical and painting more metal models again, I have to actually say I've kind of come to this opinion that I like all of them, and I don't really want any of them to go away. I don't want this to be a fine cast discussion, because I've had good experiences and somewhat bad in looking at fine cast, but that's its own sort of resin material that I don't really want to focus on too much. So I think I'll start with metal, I guess. I think I see the pros of metal miniatures is, one, that they're durable. And so whether you wanted to repaint them, if you drop the miniature on the floor, you have a much better chance of some of the major structure remaining intact. Just, if it just tips over or something like that, it's not going to snap, like just tipping over right on the table here if something just bumps into it. So from that perspective, I think that that's actually a good thing. I kind of mentioned the history, like I enjoy cleaning, and just today I just had such a good time just cleaning these up. If metal miniatures were to go away, the experience of working the metal miniature, cleaning it up, painting it, and it's a different feel than working with other products, and I'd hate that to completely go away. And so that's sort of a subjective thing, but it's, in some ways for me, it's a historical thing. It's like kind of keeping ties to where the hobby kind of came from. Another aspect to it is, as I understand it, and folks can just correct me if I'm wrong about this, but metal miniatures, the material is more expensive than, let's say, plastic or resin. But the actual casting process is cheaper. And so the production process is cheaper, even though the material itself is more expensive. And so what that does in our hobby is that it actually allows smaller companies and individuals to break into the market and produce miniatures. And so you could have more amateur or semi-professional or beginning sculptors, companies basically producing more games and things that we want in the hobby, and they can do that and have access to it and not have to either develop or hire a plastic/resin producing process. So I don't know about you, but that piece, even though that's not sort of a personal preference of which material you like, that's actually a good thing in my mind. I'm definitely, I would consider myself a GW fanboy. Like you guys that watch my channel, I'm really into Warhammer 40k, and I've got the app, and I see every single day the new stuff that's coming out, and I'm kind of hooked. Like I'm always looking for something new and what's the latest thing. And I like the big companies that produce lots of product and great product and lots of supportive material. But at the same time, I'm also into the smaller companies that are up and coming or just producing something really unique, and I like the fact that there's access to that. And so I think metal miniatures remaining actually have that it supports that in my mind in some ways. So I guess the one thing, I've heard comments where people have said that you can get higher quality in a metal cast, whether it be certain details and things like that. It's an area that I don't really know a whole lot about. Like I don't know enough about the casting process to say that that's true. And I guess it's a question for those of you that are watching that may understand the casting processes for plastic, resin, and metal better than I. Which ones can actually definitely get the best quality. There also, as actually you have the components of computer animated sculpting and or generated sculpting, which I think probably can facilitate some of these methods better than others, which definitely would, I would imagine, in some cases allow for improved quality. And so but the one thing that, but I guess there are some cons that I've noticed that made me initially want to move away from metal, and that I see as potentially problems. And one, I said dropping the miniature before, or just tipping it over, you're likely not to have the thing snap in half. But because of the weight of a metal model, if you were to drop it and it was to hit the floor, you're likely going to make some damage to your paint job. Where with a plastic or resin miniature, that's less likely to happen. And as well, the sharp edges on certain models, in my experience, even if you prime them and enamel them or put a nice finish on it to protect it, with certain models that I've had, when you have a sharp edge for a really strong detail, no matter what I've ever done, no matter how much varnish I actually put on, or how well I've actually, or what type of primer I've used, I can always get a chip. on a metal model if it has just that sculpting is there to produce a really sharp edge. There's a really good chance that you're going to see chips eventually and need to repair it. The other thing that I've noticed, and I think this is part of the casting process, is that metal miniatures tend to have more flashing. I think that's going to change company to company to a degree, but if you think about it, if you get your nice plastic kit from any number of companies, let's say model quality kit, it generally, you're going to have a sprue with your attachments that you have to scrape off, but you don't typically see flashing, like tremendous amounts of flashing on a commercial quality plastic kit. Now, I guess the only other thing that may change from company to company, but I think it may be inherent to the casting process too, is options. In my experience, commercial quality, and even to some degree the resin sprues, tend to have more options and configurability than metal miniatures. I would say even more so plastic than resin. And depending on how much conversions and variability you like in your models, that actually I think can be a positive or a negative thing for metal, that you tend to see less configurability in that sense. So I guess I've already hinted on some of the benefits of the others just by going through the metal, but for plastic, I guess from the economic point of view, getting back to that perspective, I understand the plastic casting method as being a really cheap material. So resin and plastic, I think, is cheaper as a supply, to purchase to produce these miniatures than metal. But the actual casting process and the production and the technology required is more expensive. And so bigger companies oftentimes will produce plastic, and my opinion is that likely when you're doing higher volumes, you're not as worried about the technology, because you have more sales, bigger volumes. You're paying for that process. You're already a big company. You're not worried about the production cost requirements of the technology. But then at the same time, you're actually saving a lot of money, because once you've paid for all that equipment, you're essentially you're just using plastic and resin, which is a cheaper material. So overall, in the end, it's probably cheaper for them in a higher volume situation. The plastic, I think from a production perspective, they can fit. It seems like a lot of them also happen to use the computer, I guess, facilitated processes now for design and sculpting, which allows you to put more things on the sprue, more options, and so that, I think, is an advantage for the hobbyist. One of the things that I had already touched about is with my plastic models or resin, that they do snap easier. They're less durable, and so from that perspective, that could definitely be considered a negative, depending on the sculpt in particular. I think quality is often, some people I think will say that the plastic miniatures can be a higher quality. Where that's the design process and the company itself and the sculpting, I'm not really too sure, how much that's true, because I've seen metal and plastic miniatures that I've both liked and didn't like, as far as a quality perspective, just a general quality perspective. So I don't really know. But the other thing that I think is a positive is that you do experience generally less flashing with a commercial plastic kit, and so there's less cleanup in general. Resin is a bit of a mystery to me, because as I understand it, resin, what we call resin in the hobby, is still plastic. It's just a different type. Somebody can correct me on that, but I think from a literal perspective, it is plastic. I think the process for casting resin is cheaper than commercial plastic, in that you're likely using a casting method that doesn't require as much cost for technology to produce a commercial plastic kit. I've heard folks, you know, like you often see companies like Forge World using resin, and it's just really high quality. And I just had recently purchased from Victoria Miniatures, which I think is a smaller operation, but it's producing very high quality, and they're using resin. And so perhaps there is some sort of quality advantage in that process that I'm not aware of, but that's there. It has, I think, some of the same issues as both metal and plastic in some ways as far as cons, in that, you know, it has the less durability component that a plastic model has. Perhaps maybe even more so, depending on the resin material. I've experienced resin, and I think in many cases it actually has less durability than some commercial plastic sprues. But at the same time, because it's not that high technology cost operation, you can have casting issues. And so I've seen lots of different types of resin models that have just lots of flashing and lots of cleanup, and potentially, if we were to have the fine cast discussion as a type of resin, you know, there can be casting issues with certain methods. So that's just my sort of general overview of my opinion on some of the differences of those, and really from both I guess a company level in producing as well as a hobbyist, you know, in our interests. It's funny because I have Warlord in front of me. You know, these are the Warlord Conquests. I have some bolt action ones here, and in general, like to my right is a soldier from one of their plastic kits, and to my left is just my forward observer team. Overall, I would actually say in this case, and now this is the same company, and I'm assuming it's really the same group that are offering it. It's not like these were produced by Conquest and Warlord bought them. Like, my understanding is this is somewhat of the same process. Like, they at least even tried to emulate each other, you know, by offering some plastic, and then they have a metal range. I actually personally like the metal range a bit more. I would rather personally clean up some metal models than have more assembly, you know, with these, and less cleanup. That's just in this instance when comparing within this range. Like, I would rather them have the metal and not have all the assembly. Now, for whatever reason, metal does tend to be more expensive per mini in many cases within certain manufacturers' product lines. So I'll just throw a couple of companies out there, and just as an example, it's like, you know, as an example with Warlord here, if you were to buy the same number of models of infantry for just metal individual, it generally is more expensive than if you get one of their plastic kits. At the same time, you know, for those of you that are familiar with Perry Miniatures, if you look into some of their ranges, they'll have plastic kits where you can get a large number of minis a bit more economically, I think, and then it's a little bit more expensive if you buy them from a metal perspective. They usually are in smaller quantities and a bit more expensive overall. And so, you know, as another example, I mean, I didn't really show a resin one, but I did finish my Victoria Minis Fusiliers, and you know, very high quality. I mean, like, I really like Victoria Miniatures. Like, I think that they did an excellent job. They don't feel extremely fragile, but I wouldn't want to test it. Like, I think this could snap if I really pushed it. But you know, resin and plastic are extremely light. You can feel the difference just holding this compared to the others. So I'm interested in your guys' thoughts. You know, I think the purpose of the video for me was not so much an education, you know, for those that maybe are just getting into the hobby. Although if people find this informative, that's great. I actually was just sort of, I guess, contemplating on how I've reached a point where I like all of them. You know, I don't really want to see resin, plastic. I would be disappointed if either one of the three that I just described went away for different reasons. Like, if, you know, people stopped using resin and I stopped seeing the quality that I see in either Victoria Miniatures or Forge World or any of those kinds of companies, I'd be really disappointed. If some of the companies that produce plastic kits and the kind of quality, economy in some cases, or I guess affordability, that we're seeing coming out, I'd be really, really disappointed. But then at the same time, I kind of realized today that I'd really be disappointed to see metal miniatures go away. There's a feel to it, there's a process in actually painting them and prepping them, and then there's an accessibility in our hobby to various artists and companies that produce metal miniatures, that when you combine all of those three, I'm not saying it's my favorite, but I think I'd actually be really disappointed to see them go away. Now, I'm not saying that they are going away, but there's always talk like that, on forums and things where people are kind of speculating on what's going to happen, within the hobby. So, alright, hope everybody's having a good one, and talk to you later.